Have you ever wondered why two apartments of the same size can be hundreds or even thousands of dollars apart in New York City, even where they're only a few neighborhoods away? In this video, I'm going to break down how New York City rental pricing actually works by walking through the city on a map and showing you the underlying patterns that dictate how prices change from one neighborhood to the next. This is the exact framework I use to explain New York to clients relocating here. So instead of looking at random listings, we'll focus on the two core factors that consistently drive pricing across the city. If you're new here, my name is Alan. I'm a New York City real estate agent and relocation specialist, and I make content to help people understand what it's really like to move and to live in New York City, especially if you're trying to make sense of neighborhoods, pricing, and trade-offs before you start your search. Now, if you want to go deeper, I've linked additional relocation resources in the description below. All right, let's get right into it. So here we have a map of New York City on Google Maps. And for those who may not be familiar, New York City is made up of the 5 boroughs. To the left, we have New Jersey, to the right is Long Island, and Westchester and the rest of New York State are to the north. So we have Manhattan here in the center, the Bronx to the north, Queens to the east, Brooklyn to the southeast, and Staten Island to the southwest. Now, when it comes to rent prices and home values, prices are typically the most expensive in Manhattan. In the outer boroughs, pricing tends to be highest closest to Manhattan, and as we move farther out, we generally get more value for our money. Here's a neighborhood level map that breaks things down further. Again, Manhattan is here in the center, with the other boroughs surrounding it. Now, just a quick note before we jump in. One of the top questions I get is about neighborhood safety. Fair housing laws prevent real estate agents from commenting on crime or safety levels, so I won't be covering that here. Instead, I'll walk you through how pricing works across the city and how to understand different areas from a housing and transit perspective. All right, so first, let's take a closer look at Brooklyn. Brooklyn sits below Newtown Creek, stretching all the way down towards the water. And just like the rest of New York City, prices follow a clear pattern. The closer you are to Manhattan or a fast subway connection, the higher the prices tend to be. Starting on the northwest side, in the areas closest to Manhattan, we have neighborhoods like Brooklyn Heights, Dumbo, Williamsburg, and downtown Brooklyn. Now, these are some of the most expensive parts of the borough, sometimes rivaling prices in Manhattan. Just a little south, you have the classic brownstone neighborhoods, Carroll Gardens, Cobble Hill, Borum Hill, Park Slope, and Gowanus. These areas are also on the higher end price-wise because of their charm, amenities, and excellent transit access. As we move slightly east into Fort Greene, Clinton Hill, Bed-Stuy, Crown Heights, and Bushwick, prices generally become more moderate. These neighborhoods have seen a lot of redevelopment in recent years, with new buildings and growing commercial corridors that continue to push pricing upward. Farther southeast, you'll hit large, diverse neighborhoods like Flatbush over here, Midwood, Kensington, and Ditmas Park. These areas offer a wide mix of housing options and tend to be more affordable relative to North Brooklyn, while still maintaining strong community corridors and good transit access. When you move deeper into southeast Brooklyn, into places like Canarsie, Sheepshead Bay, and Mill Basin, prices remain more affordable as well. The neighborhood feel shifts here. There are more low-rise homes, more space, and a more suburban-style layout compared to the dense brownstone neighborhoods closer to Manhattan. On the southwestern side, neighborhoods like Sunset Park, Bensonhurst, and Bay Ridge have prices that usually sit in the middle range. These areas are farther from Manhattan, but are well connected by major subway lines and have strong, established residential communities. And finally, on the eastern edge towards the Queens border, we reach neighborhoods like Brownsville, East New York, and Cypress Hills. Now, these areas haven't undergone as much development as places like Bed-Stuy and Bushwick, but that's starting to change as new housing, retail, and long-term investment continue to push eastwards. In addition to proximity to Manhattan, the second biggest factor that drives pricing is how quickly you can commute by public transportation. So if we switch over to the subway map over here, you notice that the higher priced neighborhoods always line up with the fastest or most direct routes into Manhattan. So for example, the L train over here makes Williamsburg and Bushwick extremely convenient. The downtown Brooklyn area, including Dumbo and Brooklyn Heights, stays extremely expensive because of its strong subway access and proximity to Manhattan. Over here, the F and G lines keep Park Slope, Carroll Gardens, and Cobble Hill in high demand. The 2, 3, 4, and 5 lines over here serve Crown Heights, Prospect Heights, and parts of Flatbush. And finally, the D, N, and R lines connect Bay Ridge, Sunset Park, and Bensonhurst directly to Manhattan. Meanwhile, neighborhoods further east and south often require longer commutes or more transfers, which is a major reason why prices tend to be lower compared to areas with faster subway access. Something important to keep in mind is that areas farther from a train station are typically more affordable, especially if you need to take a bus just to reach the subway. But if your commute isn't into Manhattan or you drive, these areas can actually offer great value. So in addition to distance from Manhattan, it's also about how close you are to a train and how quickly you can ultimately get into Manhattan. Now, as a general rule of thumb, pricing is shaped first by distance from Manhattan and second by how close you are to a reliable train line. I'll be making a Brooklyn deep dive video that breaks down each neighborhood cluster into more detail, so make sure to check that out. Alright, so now let's shift over to Queens, which works a little differently from Brooklyn. Queens is the largest borough by land area, stretching east towards Long Island. And just like the rest of the city, prices follow a similar pattern. The closer you are to Manhattan or a fast direct subway line, the higher the prices tend to be. If we start on the western edge, Long Island City and Astoria are the most expensive areas in the borough because they offer quick commutes, lots of development, and a convenient urban feel. As we move east into neighborhoods like Jackson Heights, Elmhurst, Forest Hills, Rego Park, and Kew Gardens, prices tend to fall into the mid-range. These areas are well connected by subway, have busy commercial corridors, and offer a mix of pre-war buildings, co-ops, mid-rise rentals, and private homes. This gives renters and buyers a wide range of options. If we take another look at the subway map, one thing we'll notice is that Queens doesn't have as many direct Manhattan-bound subway corridors as Brooklyn does. Once you go past Long Island City over here, there are essentially 3 main routes that serve most of the borough. We have the N and W lines that go into Astoria, the 7 line that runs out to Flushing, and the E, F, M, and R lines, which all run along the same corridor through Jackson Heights, Rego Park, and Forest Hills before splitting later on in Jamaica. We do also have the J, Z, and A trains in Queens, but these lines primarily serve parts of Queens by passing through Brooklyn first, so they're often less direct for commuters heading to Manhattan. Because of this, prices tend to be highest in neighborhoods located along the main subway routes. Places like Astoria, Sunnyside, Woodside, Jackson Heights, Forest Hills, Rego Park, and Flushing. More so than Brooklyn, buses are also a big part of commuting in Queens as well, and neighborhoods such as Astoria Heights, Maspeth, Middle Village, and East Elmhurst are typically more affordable because getting to the subway usually requires taking a bus. So if we look at this map, these colored lines represent subway routes, and each circle over here is a station. So even though an area like Maspeth over here is relatively close to Manhattan on the map, it's actually far from the closest subway stop, which keeps prices lower. Meanwhile, a neighborhood like Rego Park is much farther from Manhattan than Maspeth is, but because the subway runs directly through it, prices there tend to be higher. Once we move past the main subway corridors, prices generally become more affordable. So for example, beyond the last stop of the 7 train in Flushing, we reach neighborhoods like Fresh Meadows, Whitestone, Bayside, and Auburndale. These areas don't have direct subway access into Manhattan and often rely on buses to get to the train or the Long Island Railroad to go into the city, which is a big reason why you tend to get more space for your budget. And this pattern continues in Southeast Queens as well. Once we move past the major stations around Jamaica, where the E, J, and Z trains converge, we reach neighborhoods like Hollis, Queens Village, Cambria Heights, and Rosedale. These areas have a more suburban layout, and because they rely mainly on buses or the Long Island Railroad for commuting, rents and home prices are generally lower than in neighborhoods along the main subway lines. So as a general rule of thumb in Queens, the farther you are from direct subway access, the more space and value you typically get for your money. Now that we've gone through Brooklyn and Queens, let's take a quick look at Manhattan, since it's the center of the city and really sets the baseline for pricing across all the other boroughs. Manhattan is the smallest borough by land area, but the most expensive overall, and pricing can change very quickly from one neighborhood to the next. Even moving just a few blocks can make a noticeable difference, so having a simple framework really helps. Now, I like to think of Manhattan in two broad parts: everything south of 100th Street, which includes many of the most expensive neighborhoods in the entire city, and everything above 100th Street, where you generally get more space and more value for your budget. In the southern part of Manhattan, there's a central downtown strip or band of neighborhoods that include Soho, Tribeca, the West Village, Greenwich Village, and the East Village that consistently have some of the highest prices in all of the city. This area combines extremely strong demand, a limited number of housing inventory, and excellent access to subway lines, which is a big part of why pricing stays so elevated here. Now, as you move away from the strip, whether you go north towards Midtown and the Upper East Side, or south into Chinatown and the financial district, you generally start to see more value for your money. The apartments may be larger, the price per square foot tends to drop, or you simply get more for the same price. So, for example, if we look at the West Village over here, this is one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city. However, as we start going north into Chelsea, we start to get a little bit more value for our money. And as we get into Midtown West, we get even more for our money. And as we move up into the Upper West Side, we would get even more for our money. In addition, there's also a helpful pattern when it comes to Manhattan's east-west layout. Apartments located closer to the major subway corridors in the center of the island often command higher prices. I tend to think of everything between 3rd Avenue over here and 8th Avenue over here as being the most expensive, while the edges of the island, whether on the east side or the west side, can offer better value for comparable units. Now, this isn't true block for block everywhere, but it is a general rule of thumb when comparing neighborhoods. Once you move above 100th Street into areas like Harlem, East Harlem, Hamilton Heights, and Washington Heights, pricing becomes a lot more accessible overall, and you typically get more space compared to downtown and midtown. There are many other nuances that influence prices in Manhattan, so I'll keep this section on Manhattan high level for now. I'll be releasing a separate Manhattan deep dive where I go through each neighborhood cluster in detail and explain how pricing works across the entire island, so make sure to check that out as well. So now let's take a look at the Bronx, which works a little differently from Brooklyn and Queens. Now, in most boroughs, the areas closest to Manhattan are automatically the most expensive, both in overall price and price per square foot. However, the Bronx doesn't really follow that pattern as neatly, and understanding this helps make sense of why pricing varies the way it does. If we start on the south side of the Bronx, in neighborhoods like Mott Haven, Port Morris, and Melrose, we're actually in the part of the borough that's physically closest to Manhattan. Over the past several years, this area has seen a lot of new development, especially around the waterfront, and the price per square foot here can be quite high. A 2-bedroom in one of the newer buildings can easily run over $3,000, but the layouts tend to be more compact since you're paying for newer construction and a very quick commute into the city. As we move further north and west into neighborhoods like Concourse, Highbridge, Fordham, and University Heights, prices generally become more moderate. These areas have a wide mix of pre-war buildings, walk-ups, and larger residential blocks, and they're well served by several subway lines, including the 4, B, and D trains, which keep these neighborhoods in a mid-range price tier for the Bronx. But if we keep going north into areas like Kingsbridge, Riverdale, and Fieldston, the dynamic shifts again. These neighborhoods often have higher overall prices, even though they're farther from Manhattan, but the big difference is what you get for your money. A $3,000 apartment in Riverdale, for example, might be significantly larger than the $3,000 apartment in Mott Haven. The housing stock here tends to include larger layouts, mid-rise co-ops, tree-lined streets, and a more suburban-style feel, so while the total rent may be similar or even higher, you generally get more space and a different residential environment. On the eastern side of the Bronx, places such as Pelham Parkway, Morris Park, Parkchester, and Pelham Bay have prices which tend to be more affordable overall. These areas offer a range of housing styles, and since many parts of the eastern part of the Bronx rely on buses or specific subway branches, you tend to get more space for your budget compared to the neighborhoods closer to Manhattan. So unlike Brooklyn and Queens, where proximity to Manhattan and subway access are the biggest price drivers, the Bronx is shaped more by housing stock, development patterns, and the type of transit available. In the South Bronx, you might see a higher price per square foot, especially recently in the new developments. But farther north, you often get more space, even if the overall rent is similar. So now let's take a look at Staten Island, which is actually the most unique of all the boroughs. So unlike the rest of New York City, Staten Island is actually not served by the subway system. Instead, access to Manhattan and the other boroughs is mainly through the Staten Island Ferry, express buses, or by car. Now, Staten Island does have its own internal rail line, the Staten Island Railway, but it functions more like a local shuttle within the island. It does not connect to the rest of the subway system, so it mainly helps residents travel north and south within Staten Island rather than providing direct citywide transit. Because commuting options are more limited, Staten Island is typically the most affordable of all the boroughs. You will generally find larger homes, more space, and quieter, more suburban-style neighborhoods when compared to anywhere else in New York City. Another thing to keep in mind is that having a car becomes much more of a necessity here. While there are local and express buses, Staten Island is more spread out, and running daily errands or commuting often require driving. One thing to note if you're driving on and off of Staten Island regularly is that there are tolls for using any of the crossings. So this includes the Verrazano Bridge into Brooklyn, or going into New Jersey via the Goethals, Bayonne, or Outer Bridge crossings. This is an important budget factor to consider if you plan on driving for your daily commute. Now, in terms of pricing, Staten Island generally breaks into a few broad patterns. So over here, you have the North Shore, which includes St. George, Stapleton, and Tompkinsville. Now, these are typically the most affordable parts of the island, but also the closest to the ferry and to Manhattan. Then there's Mid-Island, which includes Todd Hill, Dongan Hills, and New Dorp. Prices tend to rise a bit here because the homes are larger, with more single-family properties and more suburban blocks. And over here, we have the South Shore, which includes Great Kills, Annandale, and Tottenville. These tend to offer the most space and the most suburban feel, with pricing that varies depending on the housing type, but generally remains more affordable when compared to the rest of New York City. So as a result, Staten Island gives you the most space for the lower price, but with a clear trade-off. You'll be farther from Manhattan, more car-reliant, and typically more affected by tolls and commute time, depending on where you work. Alright, so that wraps up our citywide overview of how pricing works across New York's 5 boroughs. My goal with this video was to give you the big picture logic, including the patterns that explain why some neighborhoods cost more, and how transit and geography shape rent prices across the city. Once you understand this basic framework, comparing neighborhoods and setting realistic expectations becomes a lot less confusing. Now, if you found this video helpful, please make sure to subscribe. I will be releasing detailed deep dives for each borough next. We'll go neighborhood by neighborhood and talk through pricing ranges, building types, commute factors, and what different budgets realistically look like in practice. And if you're preparing for a move or relocation to New York and want more personalized guidance, you'll find additional resources linked in the description below. Alright, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.